Thanks. So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming today so we can learn a little bit about HDInsight. Just a quick little introduction about me. My name is Christopher Schmidt. I work for Pragmatic Works. I'm a senior consultant here, and you can find me frequently presenting at SQL Saturdays, code camps, and SQL chapters around the country. I blog at a site called intelligentsql.wordpress.com, and you can find me on Twitter, and my hashtag is @SQLBISchmidt. So today we're going to be talking all about HDInsight. Just a quick introduction into it, what it is, what it isn't, and how can we start leveraging that to really start getting some really good insights in addition to our existing data warehouses and business intelligence initiatives. So the first thing big data is there's a lot of misconceptions out there about what big data is or what it isn't. So now that I've killed the punchline of my joke, our big data, we've got an answer for us. Big data is data, and it's big. And so we've got data. He's from, for anyone who doesn't know, he's from Star Trek. So he's big. Everybody else is small. Easy enough, right? So big data, the answer's out there. But no, really, big data is all about three really big things. So we're about volume, variety, and velocity. So volume is all about how much data is there. So they're projecting that by the year 2015, there's going to be 8 billion terabytes of data in the world, which is just a ton amount, especially when we think about the fact that just 13 short years ago in 2000, we still had paper processes, and only a quarter of the entire world was digitalized, where we actually had data in a format where we could manipulate it through a database. Variety is all about what kind of data it is. So is it structured? Is it unstructured? Is it semi-structured? How is it? And what do we mean by all these things? So what's structured versus unstructured? And what's semi-structured, and we'll talk about that here in a couple more minutes. And then the third thing that really makes up big data, that's a really large part about it, is all about velocity. So velocity is how fast is that data coming in? It's just like you would think of when you think of velocity. So are they machine status updates? Is the data streaming? How is that data coming to us? How quickly is it coming? Where is it coming from? And at what volume and what variety is it coming in at? And that makes it much easier for us to look at that way. So the HDInsight is an ecosystem. It's a part of Azure, but HDInsight is not big data. So a big misconception out there is HDInsight is big data. HDInsight is a platform that we can use to access big data, but it's one of several. So HDInsight is an Azure-based platform that lives on Microsoft Azure, and we can use Azure to create and configure it. If we bring HDInsight kind of on-prem, we're not really using HDInsight at that point. We're more moving to a Hadoop ecosystem, which is where we're changing it. So once we go on-prem, then we're using Hadoop. We're not using HDInsight. And the HDInsight the ecosystem is made up of all these different pieces that play together. And if we look at it from a typical data warehouse lifecycle, if we kind of think about it that way, I think it makes it a little bit easier to kind of get a hand around it. So if we look over here, we've got on the right, we've got our integration services, and we're using, just in this knowledge here, we use an Avro, and Avro is just a tool that we can use to do our integration with. And then down on the bottom there, we have our data sources. So we're getting data from Amazon, we've got some data in Azure and the data market, and we've got some data in our data storage, and we've probably got some relational databases in there somewhere too. And then as we're storing all this data, what are we storing it in? And this is where the differences between structured and unstructured data comes into play. And then we can also use HBase, which is a non-relational database where we can store this data at. So that's going to be really good for our unstructured stuff. And then we have the HDFS, which stands for Hadoop Distributed File System, where we're distributing that storage across the entire Hadoop and HDInsight ecosystem. As we're processing all this data, this is where our MapReduce jobs come into play. And we're going to talk a little bit more about MapReduce here in a couple of minutes. So our MapReduce comes into play, and it's doing all the work. So it's taking all this information, and it's processing for us and giving us the analytics and the insight. And then our third layer up at the very top there is our data access. So how are we going to access this data? So we have Hive, Pig, and Scoop. And Hive is our query language. It's just like SQL, but it's the Hadoop and the HDInsight flavor of it. It's called Hive. We have ETL, which is Pig, so we use Pig as our ETL tool. and then we're using Scoop as our data transfer. So this is what our transfer is. This is how we're moving data from place to place. You can kind of think of it like integration services, like SQL Server integration services to this at this point in time, but don't think too closely like that because it's a completely different tool, completely different platform. So a big part about moving to this big data initiative is a lot of the tools that we've come to expect, that we learn and that we use with the business intelligence ecosystem within Microsoft, and integration services, analysis services, reporting services. This isn't replacements of. These are supplements to. So as we're getting all this data, so we're generating all this data from all these different places. We're getting Twitter data, we're getting Facebook data, we're getting this huge social media revolution, right, that's going on. All these people that give us all this data and all this information. So as it's all coming in, how do we interact with that? We want to be able to report off of that. We want to bring it in with our existing reporting so we can say, okay, I know the weather right now in Dallas, Texas is whatever. And so the first question that we really need to talk about here is structured versus unstructured. So what's structured data and what's unstructured data? So structured data is data that's identifiable. So it's what we typically think of when we think of databases as database professionals. We think of data that's organized by a column and a row. It's in a database in and of itself, right? So we've got our database and it's got our columns and our rows, and we can put indexes and triggers, and we can really manage that data pretty granularly as much as we want to. And it's complete, right? So our data is always complete. So we've got, a complete picture of what's built. And then unstructured data, the big difference between unstructured data is that it doesn't have an identifiable structure. There's no column, there's no row, there's no database. It's literally, as we'll see in our example here, could be just a giant text file with millions of words in it. There's no rhyme or reason. It's just like someone opened up Notepad, typed in a whole bunch of stuff, and then we want to analyze that data. So how do we want to analyze it? And that's all unstructured. So that's our unstructured data set that we're working with. So you can think of it as as typically as an ETL developer, you think of it as messy, right? How am I even going to do this, or can I even do this with what this data set looks like? So what is HDInsight? Just a quick kind of recap of it. So HDInsight is not Hadoop. Hadoop is an on-prem installation of it. HDInsight is something that exists solely on Azure and in the cloud. And what is it? So it's an Apache Hadoop-based service. So Apache is the engine behind Hadoop. The people that made it, created it, went with it that way. And it's a modern cloud-based solution platform that can manage data of any type or size. So there's no data types, there's no data sizes. We don't have to worry about varchar 20s or nvarchar 100s or big ints or regular ints. It handles it all, no matter what it is. It handles special characters, whatever. But the big piece about big data is just having big data, we don't get any value of it based on its own. We have to do something with it, the same way we have to do something with our normal data sets. So we have to ETL it, transform it, manipulate it, and get it in a way and in a format where we can actually analyze it, work with it, and start getting some insights and some analysis around it. So HDInsight consists of, there's architecturally, the way that HDInsight works is called a head node. It works with this head node, and then it has all these data nodes underneath it. So you can almost think of it just like a normal kind of server process where we have one server that controls all the other children. And our head node, or our master server, is the server that runs all the data nodes and tells all these different pieces, this is what you need to do. And it can coordinate. It's kind of like the project manager. You guys go here, you do this, you do that, all the way through. And how does this really help us as we're going through this? So what do we get? Some big benefits that we're getting out of it is we can use this to integrate into our social media platforms. So what's Facebook looking like in regards to my company? What is Twitter doing for my company? And how do we integrate all this data into our existing environment? How can we do some advanced analytics on it? So how many times does this phrase appear in this giant text file that I have? Or what's the live changes? So what's the weather like right now, like in Dallas, as we were talking about earlier? So we have some different some different ways that we can look at this where we can really get a lot of really good value out of our big data. And so the first thing that we need to understand about HDInsight is HDInsight needs an Azure Blob storage account. And what is an Azure Blob storage account? It's almost exactly as it sounds. So it's a storage account that lives on Azure that holds all the data. So all the data that we want, that we're going to process, we actually don't house within HDInsight. We house it within the Azure Blob storage account, and then HDInsight references that storage account as it's using it. And this gives HDInsight the ability to do the computations while all that storage is being held on disk. So the Azure Blob storage account is holding all that data, keeping it on disk, and HDInsight is doing all the computations. If you think about it from a normal kind of server architecture, it's almost like a linked server. So we have our server, our storage accounts over here, and our HDInsight account over here. And yes, it does slow it down a little bit because we have to go across from storage to our HDInsight cluster. And we're actually going to see it kind of go a little bit slow here just because we're going with a really small sample set. But if we think about what we're normally passing through here of millions, billions, trillions of data points and all this different data from all these different sources and these huge data sets that we couldn't even store on a normal server, then all of a sudden it makes sense. And it's going to make more sense too when we talk about how we need to destroy our HDInsight cluster when we're done with it because it's all on Azure. So since it's all on Azure, it's all running all the time, right? So that's what Azure is. That's what it gives us. That's what's great about it. But for something like an HDInsight where we're just running some analytics on it, we don't need to run that all the time. So we can destroy our cluster when we're done, and then we can just rebuild it. And by having this data on a separate storage account, we can just leave the storage account running, and we're not losing anything by having HDInsight run it. And so that brings us to our last point there where we can also create and destroy our clusters, but we can leave the storage. So we're not losing the data, but we can still do our analysis on top of it. All right, so the first thing let's talk about is how do we create this cluster? So we talked about creating this cluster in Azure. How do we create it? What do we do? The first thing we need to do is we just pull up Azure and we need to log in. And when we log into our Azure management platform, we're going to see our list. And if we scroll down here on the left, we're going to have HDInsight. So we're going to click on this, and then we're going to click New down at the bottom. And backing up, it's just down in the bottom left down here so we can see it. And we're going to click on New. And it's a data service, so as we click on New, it asks us what kind of category we've got. So, and another note, there's some other stuff that we can do here in Azure as well. So if anyone's used reporting services in Azure, it's all managed through the same management portal. And we're going to do a quick creation, and let's give our cluster a name. So we're going to call it Intro to HDInsight. And then how big of a data set do we need? So how many data nodes are we going to need? So as we're running through, do we need 4 data nodes? Do we need 8, 16, or 32? So 32 is the biggest. I've got petabytes and petabytes of data, and I'm processing it all at once. For just this little sample here, we're just going to go with 4. And then we're going to create a password. So what's our password going to be? That's going to give us a didn't like my password, so let's give it a new password. And then we're going to select what storage account we want to use. So if we haven't created a storage account yet, we need to go back and create that. So assuming that we didn't have a storage account here, and this is where all that data lives. So all the data of what we're going through, this is where all of it lives. Yes, there are analytics in the HDInsight ecosystem. What we're actually doing, though, within HDInsight is we're processing the data, and then we're going to use another tool like, say, Power Query, where we'll get to at the end of this presentation, where Power Query is actually consuming that data in Excel and brings it into Excel. And then once it's in Excel, we can use all of our normal day-to-day, Power BI that we've got, all of our great tools that we've got today. Good question. So let's go ahead and create a storage account. Let's say we didn't have one, so we'll create storage, click on New again, and it's going to say, okay, let's create a storage account, and then what do you want to name it, and where do you want to store it? So if we didn't have one, we just give it a name, and we call it intro to. And what location do we want it in? Do we want it in the East US, West US, North Europe? And we have all these different places where we can keep it. I think for the HDInsight, I think the only ones you can pick right now are North Europe and East US, if I'm remembering correctly, but I'm not 100% on that. I know they might have changed it since a couple months ago, last time I checked. So if we create our HDInsight cluster, and we're going to click on Quick Create, and what's the name of our cluster? So we'll call it Intro to HDInsight. We'll give it 4 data nodes because that's what we need. Type in our password again, and then we click this create button, and I'm not going to do it because it's quick, but it takes about 5 minutes to do, so I'm just going to use the existing one that we've already got, so that way we're not sitting here watching it tick for 5 minutes as we're going through the presentation. So then we're going to connect to our existing cluster, so we'll say that that's created, and we're going to click on the little arrow next to it right at the top. So if we go back, right up here at the top, we've got our name and then what the status of it is. So we can see, okay, here's the name of my cluster, here's what its current status is, and here's some information about it. So we can say, okay, here's the region that it's in, and here's my subscription information, and here's what version I'm running. So what version of HDInsight am I on? And as I click on it, it's going to expand and it's going to take me to the dashboard. And the dashboard about HDInsight is everything that's going on with it. So what map jobs are being run, what reduced tasks are being run, how is my cluster working right now. So right now we can see that I got a 24-core cluster here. And it's mostly sitting idle because I don't have anything in it. I just have small sample data sets. And this is why I want to destroy it right when I'm done. Because if I leave this running all the time, it's 24 cores of resources that I'm using on HDInsight. So if I think about my Azure subscription, for anyone who's got an Azure subscription, you just see it ticking and just using up all your resources and keeping all that information consumed and all that data consumed. So it's just sucking your subscription away. So if you're not doing analytics at a time, destroy the cluster and then go back and do that HDInsight, do that new and just do a rebuild. But that's why you keep it separated in the storage account, because you're just pointing it to the storage account. So you can leave the storage account alone, turn it off, and then just create and destroy clusters as you want them. And then as we go down a little bit, it gives us some linked resources. So it tells us, okay, here's what I'm connected to. So I've got here's my storage account of what I'm connected to, and here's some more information about all that stuff. So here's when I created it. There's my status. There's my glance, and you can see that I stood this one up yesterday. And then as I click on Monitor, it's going to tell me all the information about it. So here's some more information about my active map tasks and my active reduce tasks. So if I come in here, now I've got my cluster up. So then now the next bit that I want to do is I actually want to get into actually working with the data, right? So I want to work with this data and I want to do some manipulation. All right, I've stood up this HDInsight cluster. That's great, but now what do I do? The answer to that question about whether or not HDInsight is a free service or a paid service, HDInsight is a paid service as a part of your Azure subscription. So you'd have to purchase an Azure subscription. You can, like you said, you can see right now on my screen, I just did the free trial. It's just me, so all I need is a little free trial version. I don't have any huge enterprise conglomerate data that I really need to pull, but at the same time, I can use a free trial to at least use it, get familiar with the tool, and decide if it's really going to do something to me. How do you maintain a connection for Hive tables for users to access it when you need to delete the cluster for cost reasons? So David, as far as I know on that, once you delete the cluster, they wouldn't be able to do it. So you'd need to bring it down into Excel or Power Query or a data model, and then they could just use the data model without refreshing it, without refreshing and recreating those Hive tables. So you'd bring in your Hive table analysis, destroy your cluster, and then rebuild it up in like a week or so, or whenever you'd want to refresh that data. I'll try to keep up with your questions here as we go. I know it's easier if we kind of answer them here as we're going rather than if we wait till we're all the way at the end and then we got to go back. So, all right. So once we've got all this done, next thing we want to do is we want to manage the cluster, right? So what are we going to? How are we going to manage this cluster, and what are all the different pieces that we can get as we're managing the cluster? Yeah, Jim. By destroy, I mean delete it. So once I'm done with this here, I would just click this delete button, and it would literally just delete the HDInsight cluster completely. So what are the different pieces that make up HDInsight? Before I click on that Manage button and we go into it, it's important if we just click on it. Actually, I'll just go ahead and click on it, and we'll bring it up. So if I click on it, I've got all these different pieces. So what do all these different pieces do? And then inside all these pieces, what are all the different components that make it up? So what's inside these? So if I look up here at the interactive console, I see Java and I see Hive, right? So if you haven't used your Java in a while, refresh your memory a little bit. HDInsight is all Java. And then we can use Hive as well. So what are these different tools? What can we do with them? So the first bit that we need to really kind of understand about what HDInsight does is, hang on one second, let's get our question here. How is HDInsight different from Amazon's Redshift? I'm actually not familiar with Amazon's Redshift. I know that Amazon has a cloud platform as well. I haven't done too much work with Redshift, so I wouldn't be able to say offhand if it's, I don't know, I'm sure that they probably use a similar language, be it Pig or Hive or whatever they do. I know that there's a couple of different platforms out there. Microsoft has decided to partner with Apache and Hadoop, and that's where the HDInsight main base comes from, is using the Hadoop framework. So what is MapReduce? MapReduce takes large unstructured data sets and it breaks it down by mapping and shuffling all this data together. So as we sort it, we put it, so how many times does this happen? How many times does that happen? So we're literally, if we break it down, as we see on the next slide, we're literally mapping and reducing these things together. And so what is HDFS? HDFS stands for Hadoop Distributed File System. And in the Hadoop distributed file system, data gets distributed over multiple drives on multiple servers. So we're taking this really big data set of, say, 17 petabytes of data, and we're putting a petabyte on each server. And then our main node, our head node, is going to tell which server all this information lives. And our MapReduce job is what's going to take it and run against all 17 of those servers and say, okay, let's map all this information, let's reduce it down so it's a manageable size based off of my data set. And it uses something called a jar file. And these jar files are bundled MapReduce code that can be compiled and executed. So we write this Java, we compile it, and then we execute it as a jar file. And this jar file is what actually executes our MapReduce job, sends it out there, and has it do all the work across all of our different servers. And my slide decided to stop. There we go. All right, so we can see here, here's our example based off of a 2-server input, right? So we have our semi-structured log file. We've just got a log4j file. It's got all the information about our servers on it. And the first thing we want to do is we want to map it. So the first thing we're going to say, okay, debug happens once on this server. Trace happened once. There's one instance of this, one instance of this, and we're sorting it all together. And then reduce is actually going to take it all together and create an output for us. So trace 8. So there's 8 instances of the word trace, and there's 4 instances of the word debug, and there's 1 info of fatal. So as a user or as a consumer of this data, I can quickly identify, okay, the fatal error is what I want to see. And even from an IT perspective, if we think about how much information servers generate on a daily basis of all the different data points that they do, I mean, think about the event viewer in just Windows and how many different data points are in there and where it's saving all those log files out to. And we can use these MapReduce jobs to really give us really good insight into what all of the servers are doing across the enterprise. And so that's really, and truthfully, that's really one of the big things that big data boils down to, is allowing us to analyze these data sets that are just so large that we can use these tools to do it. So MapReduce, I am going to come back up here. So, all right, so in our dashboard, so this is our HDInsight dashboard. In our HDInsight dashboard, we have all these different pieces. So the first one, I'm going to skip the interactive console for a minute. I'll come right back to it. But the first one we've got is our remote desktop, and this is just what you think it would be. So you click on it, and it's going to say, okay, we're going to remote over to the machine, and if I click, yeah, I want you to open it up with a remote desktop connection, then it's going to open up my remote desktop file and connect me to the machine. So simple enough, right? Which is great if I want to get in there and start doing some management around the server. The third option I got here is I can monitor my cluster. So if I click on monitor, it's going to open up, and I can see here's all my metrics. So here's my mappers that are running, here's my reducers that I've run, and here's what the status is. So I've had 25 runs, 25 of them is what my average is, and here's how many reducers I've had. So I've had 8. You're always going to have more mappers than reducers because there's always going to be more things to map. So if we come back here to our diagram, we can see, okay, we've got 2 maps in this case, and we have 1 reduce. So it's typically you're going to have about 2 mappers for each reduce, but it's not a linear relationship. So you might have 3 mappers per reduce, or 2 mappers, or 4 mappers. Depends on what HDInsight determines as it's doing that processing. So as we're doing this mapping and reducing, this is how many jobs that we've got. So we've got a nice dashboard here that we can look and we can see, and this is just over the last 30 minutes of everything going on. So we've run 10 jobs, 10 of them have been successful. Here's our queue, so here's what's waiting. So if we've got a whole bunch of stuff in the backlog, this is how things are working through. And then we can come over here and we can see here's our name nodes. So here's our 4 data nodes that we've got. So our name node is our head node, right? From what we were talking about earlier. So our name node manages everything else and tells everything else, this is what I want you to do in what order. And then these are all my worker nodes down here. And I can see, just by looking at this, that I've got 4 data nodes and they're all in good state. So if I had one in a bad state, I could address it and work on it from here as well. And then is my job tracker up or is it down? So this is a nice little tool that's inside of the HDInsight platform that I can use to monitor and see what's going on with my MapReduce jobs. The next tab over I've got is my job history. So if I click on this, I can see right up top, very Windows 8-ish in style. So I've got my application right here. I've got my live tile in a way, and I can see I've run 32 jobs. And if I click on that, it's going to tell me here's all my jobs that I ran, and here's what was successful and what failed. So I can see I got a couple of failures in here, and I can see I've got a couple of successes in here. And I can see what they are by looking at them, what time they started, what time they ended, and whether or not it was successful. And then I can click on it in the command line, and it's going to give me all the information about the job. So I can say, okay, here's the status, is it finished, here's what time it started, what time it ended, and that's what command I run, and that's what the output was. And then here's some debug. So if I need to come in here and do some debug information. And if I look inside the debug information, there's my map, and there's my reduce, and that's how much time I used on the CPU, on the cumulative CPU. This last tab down here is the samples tab. So if I'm just, we're just getting familiar with HDInsight, it's relatively still in its infancy. It's a really new product. We can come in here, we can play around, work with the samples. I don't want to say adventure works because that kind of gives people the wrong connotation, but you can come in here and run some samples around your HDInsight and your Hadoop sample galleries to get familiar with the tool, using Scoop, using some C# streaming, pi estimators, and word count functions. This last tab down here is my downloads. Sorry, my second to last tab. And the only thing I've got in my downloads right now is my Hive ODBC driver setup. So we can actually we can download this, and then we can actually create connections within ODBC directly over through Hive. So we can write our Hive statements directly against an HDInsight cluster and extend it out into our full platform. And the last tab we have is documentation. And documentation takes us to essentially the version of Books Online, which gives us a good insight and good introduction into all things Azure, or all things HDInsight. I'm going to go back, and then down underneath here, we've got our tasks. Is it Java or JavaScript, Ernesto? It's Java. It's a flavor of it, and we can actually use Pig, which we're going to talk about in a second too, instead of using pure Java. And Pig is a variation off of Java that is designed for big data. And then again, to answer your question, we can only use Windows Azure to use this platform and tools. Under Windows Azure is what gives us access into this HDInsight. If we install the Hadoop cluster on-prem through Windows, it's going to look almost identical to this. So once you get that, and it's not that hard to stand up a big data sandbox on your own. I think Adam just did a presentation on it yesterday about standing one up, and you could stand up a Hadoop cluster on your local machine. The dashboard for that is going to look almost identical to the dashboard as this one. So you can do it kind of either way. I'm just showing you guys the example on the HDInsight platform because I don't have my VM with me that's got a Hadoop cluster stood up on it, but we could go from it either way, and the dashboard will look very similar. And the last one there is our documentation, and then as we scroll down a little bit, we've got our tasks. So this is what tasks we've run. So we've run, from here we can see we've run PyEstimator and word count a couple of times, and we can see that it's completed. And we could also create a new job. So we can come in here, create a new job. But in order to do that, we need to give our job a name, and we need to reference the jar file that we're calling. So we wrote this Java, we wrote this Pig Latin jar file, and this is what we want. This is how we want it to run. This last one up here is our interactive console. And our interactive console is where we actually interface with HDInsight directly. So this is where we give it how all these different things to do. With Hadoop, you can run the MapReduce jobs in Python. Yes, I believe that you can use Python as well. So I don't think that there's any limit on that. I haven't tested it personally, though. So as we look through here at our Java, and I'm actually going to pull up some code that I've already written, so you guys don't have to watch me type, because I know that that's like the most exciting thing in the world is watching someone else type code. So we're going to say I'm going to put this file in here, and the command, I'm just going to use my Java, and I'm going to say browse, and I'm going to select the file that I want. So I want my word count file. And my destination, I'm going to specify where I want HDInsight to put it. So I want HDInsight to put it in the default directory under word count. And once I do that, I'm going to get a message that says that my file has been uploaded. So once my file has been uploaded, then we can start actually doing some work with it, right? So then I can list the contents that are inside of it. All right, I'm sorry, this is my MapReduce function. So this is the actual function that I've written in Java that's going to run through here and say, okay, this is where all my stuff. So I'm looking for these regex expressions, and I'm looking for this length. And then we're going to list the file that we're going to be running against. So we're actually going to be running this against a Gutenberg file. And here's our 3 files that we have. So I can see in here, here's the date and time that they were created and that they were uploaded. Here's the size. And here's the full path for it. So here's the path for the files that I can use. So which one of these do I want to run my MapReduce job against? I'm not sure, Ernesto. I don't know if you can use that with Node JavaScript file as well. Like I said, I hadn't tried that. You could certainly give it a shot and see. Or there might be something in the documentation about it. Do you need to have Java knowledge in order to learn Hadoop and HDInsight? It's helpful. If you don't, you kind of need to brush it off a little bit, but it's a big difference from the .NET days of old because .NET was developed by Microsoft. This is more of an outside tool, right? So this was developed by Apache. They used Java when they wrote it, but that doesn't mean that you can't use it. We still have a lot of functions in here that we can use. We have Hive. Hive is very similar to SQL. It's very similar to ANSI SQL, which is what it was based off of, and we can use this to query whatever our results are. So I'm actually going to tell it to execute my MapReduce program here. So here's my MapReduce program, and I'm going to tell it what I want it to run against. So I want it to run against this DaVinci file, and it's going to run, and it's going to think about it, and once it's done, it's going to spit it out and tell me that it's all done, and then I'm going to say, okay, I want you to list the results. And when I say list the results, it's going to give me, here's all the instances. So I know that in this file, the word the appeared 22,966 times, which is helpful. From a real-world example, I'm probably not going to care that much about the word the, right? So I'm really just looking for how often do these files. Maybe I'm looking for a specific keyword. So maybe up here in my MapReduce job, I'm looking for it's equal to this specific word. and then I'm going to output it to a file. And when I output it to this file, I'm going to output it to a file within the HDInsight ecosystem. Oop. And so once I've done that, then I'm going to move, and now I've got my job is run. So my Java has run, my MapReduce job is done, and now I've gone through and I've done this entire process against that file. So I've gone done all this mapping, and I've done all these reductions, and here's whatever my output is. So here's my final output here, and then here in HDInsight, here's my final output as well, right here. So once I've got this job done, I'm going to go over Pig real quick, but I don't have any examples prepared for you guys today. I kind of had to cut something because I was worried about running out of time, so I cut my Pig sample. But we'll go through the slides real quick just so we can kind of talk through them real quick. So Pig is an alternative to writing Java. So you don't necessarily have to write Java to create and run these MapReduce jobs. You can also write it in Pig Latin. And Pig Latin is based off of Java, but it's much, much simpler to write. So I know the question about, I'm a .NET developer. I've never written in Java before. Don't worry, you don't have to go out there and buy all these Java books and start learning them and start running through it. Pig Latin is actually much, much simpler to write than Java is, and it's much quicker. So a lot of the algorithms that we need to write that were written in Java that are hundreds of lines of code, we can rewrite them in Pig Latin in 5 or 2. So it's very simple. It's a very easy way to write. So using Pig is we can reduce this time needed. So it's the same way as we take all these efficiency cuts when we're developing ETL. So we use hash keys and generate these different dimension alternate lookup types that move faster, so we can reduce the time needed. When we're using Pig Latin, it's the same thing. We're reducing the time that we need to create these MapReduce jobs. And so Pig Latin statements follow a general flow of load, transform, and dump. So it's just like we kind of think of, it's a little bit different from SSIS. So in SSIS, we're really extracting, transforming, and then loading. With Pig, we're really loading it, transforming it, and then we're dumping it off in a specific location somewhere. And we can write Pig Latin in 2 ways. We can either run it in interactive mode or in script mode. So we can write it in, it's called grunt, which is interactive, or script mode is batch. So we can schedule batches to run, or we can schedule interaction or interactive mode to happen at, we can work with it and play with it. And so that's just a quick intro into Pig. Like I said, I don't have any examples here for you guys today. Sorry, I was worried about time, so I wanted to make sure that we had time to talk about the Hive and some of the fun stuff, right? The BI stuff, the stuff that us BI guys are really interested in. So in our Hive, Hive is a SQL-like language that lays on top of Hadoop. It's SQL-ish in a way. It's commonly referred to as HQL, or the Hive query language, and it's structure without modeling. So we've got this data, we're dumping it into a source, and then we can query this data without having to go through all these traditional data marts and data warehouses and all this modeling that we need to go through. One great thing about Hive is that it can handle much larger data sets than SQL, as it's querying that data in parallel across multiple nodes using MapReduce. So a Hive statement is running the MapReduce job, and it's calling the MapReduce job, and it's referencing all this data across. And as we go through, so we'll come over here and we'll do a little bit of playing around with Hive. So the first thing we need to do in Hive is we want to create the table. So what table are we going to put it in, where are we going to store it, and what's it going to look like? And I'm just going to copy this statement here so we can kind of take a little look at it. If I can get the whole thing to, there we go, show on the screen. So here we can see that I'm creating a table, and here's my syntax statement for it. I've got my create table statement, and I've got what I'm creating. So I'm creating 2 columns, a word column, which is a string, and a count column, which is an integer, which is, if I think about it from ANSI SQL, how I'd write that, it's pretty similar. And then what am I delimiting my fields by? So I'm delimiting my fields terminated by a \t. So that's my terminator. And then I'm going to store it as a text file. And when I store it as a text file, where am I going to store it at? So since I don't have a database engine backend, I need to specify where I'm going to keep it. So where am I going to put this text file at when I'm creating it? And I'm going to put this one just in my user admin folder. Are MapReduce jobs only available for unstructured data? No, you could use them unstructured data, but when you get to that structured data, that's really where you're more going to use SQL, and you've got your traditional SQL Server tools. So remember that HDInsight it's a supplement to, not a replacement of. So you could write it, but if you've got structured data, you could still run a MapReduce job on it, but the question is kind of why would you really need to, because you've got it in that structured data. You could really use Hive to open up queries, connections between SQL Server to get that data and using MapReduce. Are Pig and Hive part of HDInsight or just accessible in HDInsight? They're actually separate of. So Pig and Hive they're a part of HDInsight from this platform, the way that we're accessing it, but Pig and Hive are much, much more than just an HDInsight interface. They reference the Hadoop, so if you have an on-prem version of Hadoop, or if you're using other tools like the Amazon that someone mentioned earlier, all of these tools were really built around using the same languages. So the same Pig, the same Hive, same Java, all this stuff is pretty consistent across the platforms. I'm not going to run this create external table statement because I've already got an external table created, and it's going to error out on me if I do it. So I'm just going to click Show Tables. And when I click Show Tables here, and I'm going to say describe this table. So when I do this, it's going to tell me, okay, here's where your table is, and this is what it looks like. And it's going to take just half a second to run here. And it's going to say, okay, here's my table, and here's the columns that make it up. So I have a word string, and I have a count. So here's those two columns that I created. And then as I go through, I'm just going to do a quick select on it just so we can see. And our select statement looks exactly like it does in SQL, right? We've got select from, and our order by, and then a descending limit 10. So we're only pulling back the top 10. So it's pretty straightforward once we actually get the table created, right? We're just querying it like we normally would. And so when we click Evaluate, it's going to go through and it's going to pull some information up. And it takes just a second. Hive queries take a little bit longer, and the reason why is for this last little bit right here, right? So we've got we're running this data in parallel across all these multiple nodes. So if we've got big data sets, we want to be able to run this data across all these multiple nodes because we need to do it. But if we have a really clean structured data set that we've already put in a data warehouse and we've cleaned, it might make sense to query that data with SQL Server. So remember that we're using HDInsight to query that unstructured stuff that we don't really have a home for in SQL Server, but we still want to analyze. And so once we do that, we can see that it gave us our results back. So here's the top 10 results. Helps if you use the right word or the right keyboard shortcut. So here's our first 10 that came back, and here's the different instances of it. So we have, this is all the instances of the words, how they came through. So once we've got all this information in, now we've got it in SQL, but I don't want to write all these Hive statements. I want to be able to analyze this data now that I've got this MapReduce job written. And so to do that, we can actually use Power Query, which is our new tool that we've got as part of the Power BI platform from Microsoft. It's a new tool, it's a download, and we can connect it directly into our HDInsight cluster. So we just the same way we'd connect to an analysis services instance. So from other sources from analysis services, we just go to Power Query and we say from other sources from Azure HDInsight, and we give it the references, and then what this allows us to do is we can then join this data with all of our other sources. So then we can join it in with our data warehouse, and we can join it in with our spread marts, and I hate to even say it, but we can join it in with our spread marts and our other business pieces where we can get one nice unified view of all the data. So how do we do that? How does that look? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open up Excel. And when we open up Excel, we're going to have our Power Query link up here at the top. And on our Power Query link, if we click on From Other Sources up here, so here's our From Other Sources, and this is different from our Data tab, right? So in our Data tab, we have From Other Sources. But it's not the same as our Power Query sources. So we want to make sure that we go to Power Query, from other sources, from Windows, Azure, HDInsight. And we'll see that we have two. We actually have one for HDInsight here, and if we have an on-prem Hadoop file system, we could actually go from here as well. So we could just select this one as well. So you could do the same thing with a Hadoop distributed file system that you've deployed on-prem. And we're going to say from HDInsight, and we're going to give it the name of our cluster. And when we do that, it's going to give us our options. So what are we connecting to? This is all the information that exists in our cluster, or that exists in my cluster right here. And if I scroll down a little bit, I'm going to look for my sample data file here, because my sample data files, we've kind of gone through here and we've cleaned this up a little bit. So here's our sample file, which is a list of all of the of all these devices that have accessed data. And what we want to do is we want to split this. So right now it's in one big column that our MapReduce job is kind of processed, or is loaded into our HDInsight cluster for us, and it's tab delimited, and we're going to say OK. And so here's all of our information. So here's our date, our time. Here's the device, what model it was, I'm sorry, what model, what device, and then what platform it's running on. And then here's what state and what country it's coming from, and some other information too. And we're going to click Done. And when we click on Done, it's going to go through there, and it's going to import all this data into our workbook. Now, we don't have to, if you're familiar with Power Query, we don't have to import it directly into our workbook. We could import it directly into a data model, though, if we wanted to import it into a Power Pivot data model. And then we could join this data with the rest of our Power Pivot workbook information. And now we have a nice clean, or kind of a nice mashed up data set, right? So once I've got this information in here, now it's in Excel, right? So now the world is my oyster, as they say. I've got all these different ways how I can access this data, so I can create by loading it into my data model. Let's go here. Let's add this into our data model. I should have probably clicked that button before. Sorry about that, guys. So once we've got this added into our data model, then we can start going through and we can add our Power View reports, and we can insert GeoFlow maps, or I'm sorry, Power Maps, Power View. We've got everything that we've got in Excel is at our disposal. So we can take all this information, load it to our enterprise SharePoint site or whatever. We can get all the full range of analytical tools that we get in Excel. So here's my quick little Power View report that I made where we're pulling all this information up, and so on and so forth. So what we can do here is we can really use HDInsight to not just leverage, we can use Excel to leverage what we're doing with our HDInsight work and bring it in line with the rest of our BI platform. How does Power Query handle massively reduced files in HDInsight, and what's the best practice to mash up data sets in memory? It's kind of the standard rules of Power Pivot once you get to the mashing up the data sets in memory with Power Query. If you're going to put it in there, as long as you've got the resources on your local machine, then you can go through and do it. If you want to bring it into a tabular model, as a developer, you could bring it into a tabular model and then just have the end user access it. As far as the first question, how does Power Query handle the massive reduced files in HDInsight? Power Query is actually just pulling in the data set. So this is the final data set that HDInsight came up with and gave us this column structure. So in this case, we've only got, I think, like 50,000 records or something like that. It's like 50,000, 100,000, 60. So a little bit less than 60,000 records in this model that, when this originally started as a much bigger data set. It started as billions of rows that MapReduce went through and ran it into this 60,000 result set, and that's what Power Query is referencing. If you didn't want to load it directly into Excel because it was a bigger file, say it was 2 million rows, then you could put it in Power Pivot, or you could put it in Tabular, and Tabular would certainly have the ability to handle that as well. So you could take all this information and bring it in. All right. So, and that's actually all about I had to show you guys for today, but what's really nice about this is we can take all this HDInsight information and we can really use it to join it with our existing data warehouse pull out good insights as to what things are, to what's happening, how data is looking, and how we want this to look, or how we want to do this to get our analytical insights. Sorry, that was kind of circular. So are there any questions that I missed about anything? Melissa, did you get any that I might have missed?
No, actually, Chris, you were awesome the way you were throwing those in there. That was pretty impressive.
Oh, thank you. I was trying. It's easier to go through it when we're talking, because once
it is, because sometimes people will ask a question about what you're specifically doing at the time. So you did a great job doing that.
Great. Well, it looks like we have another question that popped in here.
Yep.
How are HDInsight and Big Data comparable? So HDInsight and Big Data are two separate things. So HDInsight is a platform that we use to access big data. Big data is a methodology. So big data is an ideology, really. So we've got all these massive data sets. We've got server logs that consume enterprises that have 100 servers or 1,000 servers, and they're all generating event logs and application logs and what's happening with my server right now. And so this is all big data because it's huge, it's unstructured, it's being stored in these text files and these log files that really don't have any rhyme or reason to them, right? We can't just write an SSIS package to load in 50 billion rows. It's more work than what SSIS can handle. But HDInsight is a tool that we can use to access this. So we can use HDInsight and we can write Pig Latin and we can write Java and we can write Hive queries against these statements. Teradata and Big Data. Teradata is a relational database platform. I'm not too familiar with what Teradata is doing in the big data market, but big data is really just our big ideology above it all. And these are different just platforms that we're using to interface with whatever this big data is. So we can use HDInsight or we can use Hadoop. So if we take the HDInsight installer and put it on our local machine, we've got HDInsight, but it's really just a flavor of Hadoop, right? Because all we're really doing is just taking the Hadoop engine from Apache and putting it on a machine. Emru, I don't think so. So the question is Hadoop a death blow to CUDA-based GPGPU analytics? I don't think so. It's more in addition to. So it's a supplement of. It's not necessarily a replacement for. I think it's really just there are new ways to look at insight and analytics and get more information out. Do I think it's going to change just like the way that BI has changed the business intelligence and the analytics industry over the last 5-10 years? Yeah, I do think it's going to make some really big changes, but I don't know if I'd necessarily say that it's a death blow to anything right now.
Awesome. And just as a reminder, everyone, our sessions are recorded and will be made available by the end of the week. It looks like one more question did pop in, but I just want to remind everybody of that. These sessions are recorded, and you can go back and review, and you can also share with a friend. So let's take that last question, Chris.
Great. Yeah. So Greg's last question is, once I've mapped and reduced from big raw data, such as the event log, is there any link or reference back to the original raw data if you need the actual details? Yeah, Greg, so there certainly is. So your MapReduce job, it doesn't replace your original files. Your original files remain untouched. Your original raw file, they remain untouched. MapReduce just runs on top of it, and it's going to create a new output file or a new output table that's going to consist of whatever your summary is. And then I see we have one more question. Wow, we're just getting a whole bunch of them. So is it possible to use HDInsight to replace SSIS? I'm going to tackle that one real quick. HDInsight is not a replacement for SSIS. HDInsight is just a tool to use our big data. SSIS will always have a place for moving data sets. You're talking about data sets here where you have millions of files or hundreds of files across multiple places where one server is never going to be able to do all that work, no matter how great we make our servers. Even if we have, some of these really cool servers that some of these theoretical physicists have out there that are, 300 terabytes of RAM and, 3 petabytes or 3 zettabytes of just storage. Like, even if we had servers that big, we still couldn't process these files in a day. It's just more resources than a server could ever use. So you wouldn't want to use HDInsight to replace it, And within HDInsight, you'd use MapReduce, or you'd use Scoop, or you'd use some other tool to do this ETL for these bigger packages, and then you could still use SSIS for SQL Server. And then a few other scenarios where big data can be used is, it's kind of hard to say. There's tons of different ways that you could use big data. So cell phone information, each industry has, almost everybody has big data, but nobody really thinks of it. So we've got servers, which are a really big one from an IT perspective. And we've got Twitter information, which is, if you're a retail store, really important information to you, or Facebook if you're into marketing. So there's all these different places where we can go.